On June 14th, 1984, power engineer Chloe Harper left the NYPA office, carrying her briefcase and the final daily voltage deviation log sheet, walking along Broadway under the sweltering heat of Newburgh. 20 minutes later, a taxi driver saw her standing next to a man in a gray coat at the entrance to the Lake Street industrial area. Then both of them vanished. No cries for help, no physical evidence, no body. During 8 months of searching, NYPA concluded she may have left voluntarily due to job stress. The family was told that perhaps Chloe wanted to start a new life, while the town rumored she was involved in a secret relationship. Then, in 1997, when a group of young people opened a steel manhole cover behind the abandoned power plant, they saw arcing streaks on the wall and a piece of fabric resembling Chloe's coat caught on a metal bar. When police returned just 40 minutes later, the basement was empty as if nothing had ever been there. But it was the electrically conductive dust clinging to Chloe's log sheet. The forensic team extracted DNA from it 41 years later that changed everything. Chloe never went to the plant area alone. Someone stood right next to her in the moment the first arcs flashed. Someone knew exactly which equipment was running in the dark that day. And someone believed that secret could wait 4 decades to come to light. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Summer afternoons in Newburgh carried a distinctive, oppressive feel, that thick air settling between the old streets and the long rows of abandoned factories stretching along the Hudson River shore. Dark brick walls cast long patches of shadow onto the pavement, and the industrial area on Lake Street stood silent like a forgotten land where even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. Against that backdrop, Chloe Harper left her small apartment in the familiar quiet of quitting time. She locked the door, gently adjusted the strap of the briefcase she was holding, and stepped down the stoop with the same demeanor as any ordinary workday. A neighbor happened to see her, and only remembered that Chloe still wore her polite smile whenever someone greeted her, nothing unusual in her eyes or her stride. Yet the route Chloe chose that day was completely different from her usual one. Instead of following the familiar path toward downtown, she turned toward the old plant on Lake Street, where windows were boarded up, rusted metal sheets sealed the entrances, and most residents had no reason ever to pass by. It was the kind of place people glanced at and avoided, no one stopping unless absolutely necessary. Chloe showed no sign of looking for anyone or expecting anything special, but that turn made many wonder what could have caused her to change her habits so drastically. The only person who witnessed Chloe's final moment was a taxi driver parked nearby for a break. He saw her standing in a brief conversation with a man wearing a gray coat. Despite the sweltering weather, the man's clothing remained covered, which caught the driver's attention. Their exchange didn't last long and showed no signs of tension. No arguing, no resisting gestures or threats. Just the two of them saying something very quietly, enough to give the sense they knew each other but weren't close. Then Chloe walked toward the factory buildings, disappearing into the dappled shadows behind the faded brick walls where the last daylight could no longer reach. From that moment, she vanished, as if melting into the stillness of a neighborhood empty of people. The taxi driver watched a few more seconds, then returned to his driver's seat, completely unaware he had just seen the last anyone would ever see of Chloe Harper. The evening passed with the family's initial confusion at not hearing from her. Chloe had never gone anywhere without letting someone know. But in those first hours, they still tried to find reasonable explanations. Stuck at work, visiting someone, or simply forgetting to call. But the more they called, the more they only heard endless ringing. When they contacted the office, Chloe's colleagues confirmed she had left the office as usual that day, with no signs of distress or unusual mood. No one knew why she appeared near Lake Street, an area unrelated to her work and not on her way home. And as the city gradually sank into night, the prolonged silence grew terrifying in a way the Harper family could no longer ignore. They clung to the hope that Chloe was still somewhere nearby, just not back yet. But when that hope could no longer hold against the reality that every effort had failed, they were forced to do what they never wanted: report Chloe Harper missing to the police. That night, as soon as the missing person report was received, Newburgh police immediately activated the emergency protocol for an adult disappearance under unusual circumstances. Although most missing persons cases are monitored for a few hours before escalating the investigation level, the look on the family's faces, combined with the fact that Chloe had no history of suddenly leaving home, prompted the first patrol car to be dispatched to the Broadway area faster than usual. 2 officers spoke directly with the family, recording key details: the time Chloe left home, her clothing, items she was carrying, daily habits, and especially the route she normally took. Just a few minutes later, a radio report confirmed that the last place Chloe was seen was the area bordering Broadway and Lake Street, near the row of old factory buildings. That was a location that didn't appear in any of Chloe's usual routes. This detail immediately shifted the investigative team into high-risk assessment mode. Officers quickly began building a timeline from 0 to 4 hours before the time of disappearance based on information from co-workers, neighbors, and the time Chloe left the office. She had left work in a completely normal state, showing no signs of anxiety or haste. There were no unusual calls or messages on the landline phone at the apartment. Every piece of time was pieced together with the greatest possible accuracy to identify the unexplained gap, and that gap was precisely the stretch leading to the old industrial area. When the sole witness from that afternoon was brought to the station, he recounted what he had seen. Chloe talking with a man wearing a gray coat. Average build, not too tall, calm movements, no hostile gestures. But there was one detail he only recalled when asked a second time: the faint sound he initially thought was the metallic clank of a rusty door. It was uneven, slightly vibrating, and at one point sounded like a soft hiss, like an electrical device shorting out, or something vibrating, he said. This was the first time that detail emerged, and it was immediately entered into the initial report as a point needing clarification. The investigative team established the last known location, right at the entrance to the industrial area, a place thick with the atmosphere of metal dust, old oil smells, and crumbling brick walls. After marking the LKL, police opened a level 1 search radius of approximately 500 meters around it. Officers used high-powered flashlights, sweeping along cracks in the concrete floor, tracing wall edges and access paths into the abandoned workshops. Every spot, with potential for showing movement, no matter how small, was checked thoroughly. In the mottled light of the search team, the deep, sucking shadows inside the warehouses made the area even more unpredictable. Some surfaces with thick dust layers showed no one had passed through in days, but in other places the dust was disturbed, not clear enough to determine direction, but enough to raise the possibility someone had been there recently. 2 officers followed a long drag mark in the back lot, but it quickly disappeared when it hit hard ground, rendering further tracking pointless. What particularly caught the investigative team's attention was the complete absence of any of Chloe's belongings. No purse, no papers, no dropped keys or pen, nothing to suggest she had dropped anything or been forced to leave items behind. That absolute emptiness created a sense of being out of control. Victims of attack or panic rarely vanish so cleanly. Around midnight, a secondary sweep team reported finding a set of human footprints leading into one of the workshops covered by a metal sheet. However, the footprints could not be identified as belonging to any specific gender, nor did they show signs of a struggle. The scenario of Chloe walking in there voluntarily remained possible, but at the same time, the possibility that she had been lured could not be ruled out. When the taxi witness mentioned one last time the strange sound he had heard while encountering Chloe, the metallic or electrical vibration coming from somewhere inside the factory, the atmosphere in the investigative team's workroom fell, silent for a beat. In an industrial area that had been abandoned for years, with no active power lines, no workers, and no operating equipment, that sound had no reason to exist. That detail was added to the report as a factor making Chloe's disappearance more unusual than any ordinary vanishing. The first night of investigation ended with more questions than answers, and not a single clear clue to explain why a woman walking through a quiet neighborhood could disappear so completely in just a few short minutes. Chloe seemed to have slipped out of the real world in a way that was too silent, too pristine, as if her traces had been erased by someone or something before the police even had a chance to understand what was happening. Newburgh sank into the strange silence of the following morning, and the industrial area along Lake Street emerged like a vast maze of forgotten concrete blocks, where once hundreds of people worked every day, now left with only rusted skeletons and broken window panes reflecting the cold sunlight. The investigative team quickly realized that the area where Chloe was last seen could not be approached through guesswork searches. They needed structure, an overall map to determine what in this area was important enough or suspicious enough to make a woman like Chloe turn into it while walking home. On the large wooden table in the police station's workroom, they spread out an old 1970s industrial map of Newburgh and began marking. Investigators circled each abandoned factory building from years earlier. The mechanical parts manufacturing shop, the auxiliary shop of the West Newburgh plant, the steel warehouse closed since 1978, two warehouses once used as supply yards, and especially the old substation no longer in operation, but still retaining its foundation, and some power lines strung across rotting wooden poles. Many of those structures had no doors, no signs, no remnants of the industrial activity that once existed. The area had been left to the ravages of time, becoming a place police rarely had to intervene in unless there was a special reason. But it was precisely because of that emptiness that Chloe's presence here became harder to explain. Why would she, a careful person with a regular routine, choose to pass through an area no one used anymore? Once the map was fully marked, one investigator mentioned technical data archived by NYPA. In the weeks leading up to Chloe's disappearance, Newburgh's power distribution system experienced small but continuous fluctuations. The magnitude wasn't large enough to attract widespread attention, but unusual enough to be logged in internal monitoring records. When those fluctuation points were overlaid on the industrial area map, they almost perfectly aligned with one zone, the cluster of structures around Lake Street. No one had proof that Chloe had paid attention to them on the day she vanished, but she was a technician who had monitored similar deviations. The possibility that she was checking that area again was far from small. After the map analysis was complete, the forensics team was brought in to systematically enter each structure. One group went into the old mechanical shop, where the floor was covered in dust as thick as a carpet, and the machinery had long been dismantled. No signs of recent entry or exit. Another group approached the ruined steel garage, discovering strange tire tracks but too faint to conclude when they appeared. Another group reached the old supply warehouse, now containing only broken shelving and empty containers. Most of the industrial area carried the deathly stillness of forgotten time, but as they moved deeper into the inner workshop area, one small warehouse drew far stronger attention than any other place. There, flashlight beams sweeping across the back wall revealed a detail that made two investigators stop and look closely. A thin black scorch mark, not very wide but stretching vertically, clinging to the brick surface like the trace of an electrical arc. It didn't resemble a fire set by a person, wasn't a burn spread from flammable material. Its sharp char suggested heat generated by high current, a type of surface damage that power technicians would recognize instantly. One officer gently touched near the wall surface and noticed the brick slightly flaking, as if heat had affected it not long before the area was examined. Though the exact timing of the scorch couldn't be proven, its characteristics made the investigative group question, what in an abandoned industrial area could produce an electrical discharge powerful enough to leave such a clear mark? This arc mark also matched the taxi witness's description of metallic or electrical noise heard from inside the factory right when Chloe was standing talking to the man in the gray coat. Two separate pieces of information, the strange sound and the scorch mark, began to create the sense that this area was not as silent as it appeared. What caught the investigative team's attention wasn't just the arc evidence, but Chloe's choice itself. A cautious person who didn't like wandering into deserted places, yet she appeared exactly here that afternoon. No one who knew her could offer a reasonable explanation for it. Stepping into that workshop area was like entering an unmarked zone on the map of her everyday life, yet Chloe had stepped into it. And the moment the question of why she turned in that direction arose, the entire investigative team felt they were facing a puzzle unrelated to ordinary disappearances. What purpose did Chloe have in coming here? What circumstances caused a technician with a steady commuting habit to deviate from her familiar route? And if someone had met her inside the workshop, why leave no trace at all except for a strange scorch mark on the wall? Those questions clung tightly to the team's thoughts, and every gaze turned back to the industrial area map, where the marked symbols grew more numerous by the day. But the answers remained completely empty. The workshop area behind Lake Street, on the morning of the first inspection, emerged like a mute maze, where each step of the investigative team echoed sharply between the empty, dust-covered corridors. Light from the broken high windows slanted down in jagged streaks across the cracked concrete floor, making the space feel even more unpredictable, and full of the sense that someone had passed through not long ago. Even so, the full sweep of the area yielded no direct sign of Chloe Harper. No purse, no briefcase, no scrap of paper, no keys, no wristwatch, or any personal item belonging to her. The fact that an adult could vanish completely without leaving even the smallest trace made many investigators pause and look around longer than usual, because even the quickest attacks rarely stayed that clean. The absence of personal belongings pointed to two clear possibilities. Chloe entered here under her own volition, or she was forced to leave so quickly she had no chance to drop anything. Signs of a struggle, if there had been one, would have left scratches, skid marks, or at least scattered objects. But the concrete floor remained inexplicably intact, except for patches of disturbed dust whose timing could not be quantified. The investigators continued checking every entrance, every side room, every corridor segment, leading deeper into the complex. When they entered the warehouse where the scorch mark on the wall had been found earlier, another area revealed a new detail: footprints at the left side door. They weren't sharply defined prints, but the depth in the dust and the weight distribution showed at least two people had passed through. One smaller and narrower, very likely a woman's shoe. One wider, belonging to a man's shoe. Both pointed inward, and notably, there were no footprints heading back out. Officers placed measuring tapes, estimating the woman's shoe size at roughly 7 or 8, perfectly consistent with Chloe's shoe size. The man's prints were larger, hard to attribute to anyone specific, but not the size of a teenager or an elderly person. This made the hypothesis of the man in the gray coat appearing in this area far more plausible, though there was still no evidence strong enough to confirm it was the same person. The footprints running straight deeper into the warehouse made the atmosphere in the investigative group grow quieter. Investigators moved carefully between the disturbed dust patches, avoiding anything that could be evidence. Everyone understood this was a rare and tiny clue in a disappearance that was otherwise too clean. As the forensics team pushed farther into the warehouse, the faint smell of ozone appeared again. Not everyone on the team was familiar with it, but those with some knowledge of high-power equipment recognized it immediately. The smell of a small amount of air ionized after a high-voltage current or spontaneous electrical discharge had passed through. That cold, sharp, dry scent lingered, its source unclear, but strong enough to make one officer stop and note it in the report. In a workshop that had had no electrical activity for at least a decade, the presence of ozone was completely abnormal. It could suggest some device had been activated recently, or a makeshift discharge system. Though no conclusion could be drawn yet, the combination of the wall scorch mark and the ozone smell made the investigative team think more seriously about a technical element. No remaining machinery could naturally produce such a phenomenon. The scene investigator in charge offered the assessment that ozone appearing in an environment without any official power source raised serious questions about safety and the possibility that someone was secretly using the workshop for their own purposes. One of the officers voiced an unconscious hypothesis. If someone's experimenting with something here, they wouldn't want anyone else to find out. No one replied, but every gaze turned deeper into the warehouse, where flashlight beams only illuminated narrow strips of light. They found no blood, no drag marks, no items of Chloe's left behind. But the combination of small details, the two sets of footprints, the ozone smell, the scorch mark was enough to evoke the feeling that this was not an ordinary kidnapping. If a man had met Chloe here, he didn't necessarily have to use violence to force her. A lure, a wrong step, or some unexpected reason could have made Chloe walk inside without foreseeing the danger. The investigators stood at the warehouse entrance, where the outside light gradually shifted to the deep red of dusk, and they all understood that something in this area, some form of illicit activity or technical experimentation, was happening quietly. No one knew what had happened to Chloe in the minutes she vanished from the witness's sight, but the traces around the workshop made it clear to them that this was not a random disappearance. Not just anyone had a reason to step into an abandoned warehouse, but someone had brought Chloe in there or caused her to choose to go in, and what kept them clinging to that thought was the invisible signatures of technology. Ozone in the air, an unexplained scorch mark, and the icy silence of a space that seemed dead but was not entirely asleep. When the physical traces around the workshop area failed to provide a clear explanation, the investigative team shifted to a different approach: Chloe's work. As a power measurement technician with NYPA, Chloe was responsible for monitoring voltage fluctuations across various residential and old industrial areas in Newburgh. Most deviations in the distribution system were minor, to the point of being unnoticeable brief oscillations that stabilized on their own after a few minutes. But the month leading up to her disappearance was different. The technical logs that NYPA provided to the police showed a distinctive series of continuous voltage deviations over 3 weeks. Abnormal rises and falls that didn't follow the patterns of natural grid faults, and they were particularly concentrated in one specific area, the cluster of structures around Lake Street. This was exactly the zone where police had discovered the arc mark and the ozone smell during the scene examination. These deviations were first noted by Chloe, but what stood out was that they never appeared in the official reports and showed no sign of having been forwarded to management. Instead, Chloe had a characteristic habit. She would personally verify small anomalies before including them in reports to avoid raising alarms over uncertain data. Colleagues described her as meticulous but quite independent. If she spotted something unclear, she would often go back to check 2 or 3 times before notifying anyone. This led the investigative team to consider the possibility that Chloe had deliberately gone to that area to recheck a voltage deviation that hadn't yet been documented. When cross-referencing her work logs with the time of disappearance, a major coincidence emerged. On the afternoon Chloe vanished, the system recorded a stronger than usual fluctuation, the largest in the 3-week series, and it occurred precisely during the window when she left the office. That fluctuation lasted a few minutes, causing temporary discrepancies on some old feeder lines, but not large enough to trigger a widespread outage. However, to a technician like Chloe, it was a clear sign worth checking in person. One investigator opened the industrial map and pointed to the old substation that had been decommissioned since 1978. The substation had once served as an intermediary for many of the industrial area's power lines, but after the plant shut down, the entire facility was abandoned, leaving only a few broken poles and inactive wiring. Yet all the voltage deviations Chloe had been tracking converged on this area that was no longer receiving any official power. There was no technical reason for a completely dead substation to produce any fluctuations in the current system. This led police to hypothesize: if an unauthorized power source or unregistered device had been activated in that area, it could generate fluctuations that the system would detect. And if Chloe had noticed this, she could very well have decided to go find the source of the deviation before filing a report. Her route from Broadway turning toward Lake Street began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just a random choice or a mysterious meeting with the man in the gray coat. If Chloe was following a chain of anomalies, the path leading to the old industrial area was the most logical one to investigate. But this was also a fairly isolated zone. A woman walking into such a place late in the afternoon would need a solid reason. One investigator asked during a quick meeting, if she knew something was wrong, would she try to verify it right away? No one had an answer, but the power logs showed the timing of the major fluctuation matched perfectly with Chloe's journey from home into the industrial area. This not only explained the possibility that Chloe had entered the workshop voluntarily, but also opened a new investigative direction. She may have stumbled onto something more dangerous than a routine deviation. As the technical facts gradually connected with the disappearance location, the investigative team saw more clearly that the arc mark, the ozone smell, and Chloe's unusual route were not isolated details. Everything pointed to one thing: something involving an unauthorized power source or an unknown origin device was present in that area. And if Chloe had discovered it, her behavior fit perfectly with someone trying to clarify an unexplained anomaly. What troubled everyone most was that she chose to check it without telling anyone. That caution had once made Chloe the best in her technical team, but it had also put her in danger without anyone around realizing it in time. When the investigative team wrote in the report that the victim's direction of travel aligns with work-related objectives concerning voltage fluctuations, everyone present understood they were dealing with a rare type of disappearance. One where technical details played a role just as crucial as criminal elements. Chloe had followed the trail of an electrical anomaly, and that journey led her to Lake Street, where every clue unexpectedly converged. But the answer still remained behind the rusted factory walls, refusing to reveal itself. Chloe's work file forced the investigative team to re-examine everyone who had ever been connected to Newburgh's power infrastructure, especially individuals with deep knowledge of the old systems and who had worked at the abandoned substations. The initial list was quite long, but when cross-referenced with data related to the voltage deviations, as well as the location where police found signs of electrical arcing, every piece began narrowing down to one standout name: Raymond Cole. Cole had been a power engineer, whose research abilities were highly regarded in the late 1970s. People who worked with him back then described him as someone with unconventional thinking, frequently proposing energy models that most colleagues hadn't considered. Internal NYPA documents showed he was particularly drawn to ideas revolving around magnetic resonance systems and nonlinear oscillations, things he believed could generate energy at amplitudes far exceeding standard grid levels. That fascination gradually turned into an obsession. In 1979, Cole independently built a device description he called a homemade magnetic resonance system, based on the principle of combining harmonics with unstable voltage. The technical evaluation report concluded that his device had the potential to create uncontrolled discharge states, posing dangers to operators and nearby structures. The report stated clearly, "Cannot be experimented under industrial conditions. Risk exceeds safety limits." Just a few weeks later, Cole was fired. He left the official workforce, but traces of his obsession with resonance models did not disappear. Some former colleagues recounted that in the years after leaving NYPA, Cole continued sending letters exchanging ideas about alternative energy models, describing designs he believed were ahead of their time. He didn't join major research organizations, but he spent time scavenging components, buying old conductors, and showing up in places where power lines had been dismantled. Those behaviors, at the time, were merely seen as eccentric. But in the context of Chloe's disappearance, amid unusual arcing signs, they became far more noteworthy. When the investigative team approached the residential area around Lake Street to find more witnesses, some people recognized the description of Cole. An elderly woman living near the old plant said she had once seen a tall, thin man with slightly curly hair, often standing and observing the industrial area in the late afternoon. Another person recounted encountering him several times over the years, always carrying a tool bag or pushing a small metal cart toward the abandoned workshop buildings. These statements couldn't confirm specific dates, but his presence around an area no one else visited raised plenty of suspicion. The statement from a young man who had done temporary work in the area drew even more attention from the investigative team. He said that sometimes he saw faint flashes of light inside a deep warehouse, light that resembled arc light rather than ordinary bulbs. This was immediately linked to the scorch mark on the wall and the ozone smell discovered by the forensics team. If anyone had both the knowledge and the recklessness to activate a homemade device inside an old workshop, it was hard to imagine anyone other than Cole. A check of the city's residency records revealed an even stranger detail. Cole left Newburgh right around the time the system first recorded the voltage deviations that Chloe had been tracking. There was no evidence he knew Chloe, but his disappearance coinciding with the start of the oscillation series led police to question whether he was avoiding someone's attention after they had noticed signs of abnormality in his experimental area. Cole's background showed no history of violence or conventional criminal motives. He had no criminal record, no involvement in financial disputes or personal conflicts. But what made police particularly wary was the personality noted in his personnel file. Stubborn, overconfident, dismissive of safety protocols, and frequently ignoring warnings to pursue experiments he believed could prove what others couldn't see. Those who had worked with him described a man immersed in his own technical world, unconcerned with what others thought, and sometimes acting as though the devices he created were more important than any risk involved. All those details combined to paint a clear picture of someone capable of operating an unauthorized discharge device in the old industrial area, and the only person the investigative team knew had sufficient expertise to produce the technical signs Chloe had been following. As the suspect list narrowed, Cole emerged not because of typical criminal motives, but because of the perfect fit between his technical knowledge, unusual behavior, and his presence around the area. The investigators reached their first major notation. If Chloe had discovered something at Lake Street, then Cole was the only one with both the reason and the skill to intervene in it, even to the point of stopping someone from approaching the device he was trying to keep secret. When the name Raymond Cole appeared in the suspect file, the investigative team returned to the old power plant with a clearer objective: determine whether any unauthorized electrical system had been installed or operated around the time Chloe disappeared. This return visit was no longer a general sweep but was conducted with electric field measurement devices, leakage current sensors, and physical survey tools from the Field Technical Division. They started from the area previously considered the center of the strange traces, the main building of the old power plant, where large cables still hung, suspended from the time it was shut down in the late 1970s. When strong light shone on the wall, an officer immediately spotted something they had missed the first time. A section of high-capacity conductor lying close to the wall edge had been crudely reconnected, using homemade metal splices instead of standard safety fittings. The dust layer on the wire had been swept clean along a long vertical path, proving it had been used recently, not a remnant from when the plant was still operational. Dark scorch marks around the connections showed that current had run through at significant intensity. Police noted this was not the work of an amateur. The person responsible had to understand power line structures, know how to create temporary pathways, and possess enough knowledge to initiate current flow without blowing the old system. The likelihood of an ordinary person doing this was almost zero. These findings further evoked Cole's technical capabilities, as he had once researched exactly the kind of current configurations that could produce unauthorized resonance. But the discoveries didn't stop there. In a rear compartment, the concrete floor showed an unusual discoloration. When the technical team illuminated it and used probes to check the surface structure, they clearly saw a layer of melted metal that had flowed and spread across the floor, hardening into rippled lines like candle wax but hard and sharp. Preliminary analysis indicated this type of molten metal typically appeared during high-amplitude electrical discharges that generated intense heat in an instant, not like ordinary fire or explosion, but more akin to the effects of an arc strike. The lead investigator noted in the log that the melt pattern is consistent with a sudden power source in a thick metal environment. This assessment, combined with the previously detected ozone smell, gave the entire team even more reason to view the power plant as the epicenter of the case. Farther toward the far corner of the plant, near the area that once housed the switchgear, the ground revealed another trace. Long grooves dragged through the thin dust layer, as if a heavy object had been pulled by hand or on small wheels. Those marks curved gently toward the semi-underground basement that once led down to the cable handling area. The sense that something had been moved in haste became clear when they saw the dust on either side of the drag marks was almost undisturbed, indicating the pull had been one way and followed a single curved path. The investigative team couldn't identify what the heavy object was, but moving large goods or equipment into an abandoned plant was rare, unless someone was using the place to conduct experiments or hide something that needed to stay out of sight. While police documented the physical traces inside the plant, another piece of information from a witness unexpectedly added to the chain of events. A young man living in the nearby residential area stated that on the evening Chloe disappeared, he saw a faint flash of light coming from behind the plant fence, like flashing lights or electrical arcing, but he assumed it was a homeless person starting a fire and didn't pay further attention. Now, after hearing about the investigation, he realized the timing of the light he saw matched the window when Chloe was last seen. The investigative team cross-referenced this statement with the power logs and noticed a striking coincidence. The time the light was reported corresponded to a voltage fluctuation recorded in Newburgh's distribution system. That fluctuation was part of the deviation series Chloe had been tracking before her disappearance. It wasn't strong enough to cause a blackout but produced changes that only system monitoring technicians would notice. The fact that this fluctuation aligned with the witness seeing the light, and also aligned with the time Chloe appeared around the power plant, created a logical chain the investigative team couldn't ignore. It was possible a high-power electrical device had been activated inside the old plant at that exact moment. What remained? The unauthorized conductors, the melted metal traces, the drag marks of a heavy object, the light in the night, and the fluctuation from the substation all combined to show that significant technical activity was taking place in a location that, in theory, should have been completely inert. When the investigative group concluded the second sweep, no one doubted anymore that this area contained something not only connected to Chloe's presence here, but directly tied to the nature of her disappearance. All the technical clues converged around a single assumption. Someone had activated an unauthorized electrical device or system inside the abandoned power plant, and Chloe may have walked in at the precise moment it was operating. The technical traces inside the old power plant made the investigative team believe they were getting close to an answer. But the more they expanded the scope of gathering statements, everything became tangled in a way that was hard to control. The Lake Street area was sparsely populated, and not a place with many reliable witnesses. But just a few days after the police released Chloe's photo and called for assistance, a series of statements began coming in, and most of them contradicted one another. A middle-aged man living nearby claimed he had seen a green box truck drive into the old plant exactly on the afternoon Chloe disappeared. He described the truck as having a closed box, somewhat old, and it seemed to rev hard to climb the rough ramp leading into the industrial area. According to him, the truck disappeared behind the fence and didn't come back out during the time he was there. This immediately forced the investigative team to reanalyze approaches to the plant, because if a truck had entered, it could be related to transporting equipment or heavy objects, reminding them of the drag grooves under the concrete floor that police had noted during the previous sweep. But just a few hours later, another witness told a completely different story. A young woman living in an apartment facing Lake Street said she saw an old sedan leaving the plant area right before dark. She clearly remembered the engine's raspy sound, the weak headlights, and the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat. She wasn't sure if anyone was in the back seat, but she was confident the car left the area very close to the time Chloe vanished. The appearance of two different vehicles, one entering, one exiting at around the same time, made the investigative team cautious. Both could be true, but they could also be unrelated, separate observations. A large truck entering the plant in the afternoon might have nothing to do with an old sedan leaving in the evening, but it was also impossible to rule out that one or both vehicles were connected to Chloe's disappearance. The problem was, no one could pinpoint which vehicle appeared close to the time the witness saw Chloe talking to the man in the gray coat. While police were trying to reconstruct the picture of vehicles around the area, another statement made everything even more chaotic. A homeless man who had slept in the ruined area near the old mechanical shop said he heard a clanking sound like metal being dragged on the afternoon Chloe disappeared. The noise lasted a few seconds, with the tone of something heavy scraping on concrete or metal surface. He didn't see anyone, nor could he tell exactly where it came from, but his voice was firm, like someone was pulling something really heavy out of a dark place. This matched the drag groove traces police had found, but it didn't help determine the timing or who made the sound. That ambiguity left the investigative team unable to know whether the noise happened before, during, or after Chloe appeared at the plant. They still tried to rely on objective data to bolster the statements, since nearby camera systems might help clarify the timing of vehicles entering and exiting the area. However, in 1984, the Lake Street area only had a few stores and one gas station with low-quality analog cameras. When police extracted the footage from the day Chloe disappeared, they only got blurry vehicle shadows, almost impossible to distinguish shape, color, or license plates. The view of the road leading into the old power plant was obscured by metal signs and wide dark patches that always caused the cameras to lose detail. Even though officers tried enhancing contrast and magnifying each frame, they still couldn't determine whether it was the green truck or the old sedan or even if both might have appeared without the camera capturing it clearly. When the three conflicting statements were placed side by side, everything became nearly impossible to string together into a solid investigative direction. One witness said a truck entered, another said a sedan left, one heard a heavy object being dragged. The cameras confirmed nothing. The timelines kept overlapping without forming a logical sequence. This made the investigative team even more cautious about drawing any conclusions related to vehicles in the area, because just one wrong inference could send the entire investigation completely off track. However, amid those chaotic statements, one element kept being repeated by more witnesses than any other detail. It wasn't the vehicles, not the appearance of the man in the gray coat, nor any shadowy figures in the night. It was the strange noise of metal and electricity sounds that no one could explain. At least 4 people living around the Lake Street area said they heard something like electrical arcing, or like metal vibrating under pressure, especially in the late afternoon and evening on the day Chloe disappeared. One described a soft whistling in the air. Another said the sound seemed to come from inside the old power plant, mixed with metallic echoes. No one could identify the source, but everyone recognized it wasn't a usual sound in an abandoned industrial zone. In the entire chaotic chain of statements, this was the only common point: a sound connected to the recorded signs of arcing, ozone, and scorch marks. It was the one thing that didn't change, even as statements about vehicles and people kept contradicting each other. Those strange sounds, though simple and not clear enough to identify a perpetrator, were the only unified part in the fragmented story from the residents. And for the investigative team, it was also a sign that they were getting closer and closer to the true nature of what had happened in the plant that afternoon. Chloe vanished, something that wasn't just ordinary crime, but very likely tied to some secret technical activity inside those crumbling walls. When the statements about vehicles kept leading the investigation into confusing dead ends, the search team received orders to expand the sweep to the area behind the old power plant, the spot least noticed by anyone because it was hidden behind a row of brick walls and covered by a wild, overgrown lot full of weeds. This was land that most residents hadn't set foot on in years, except for a few homeless people or curious teenagers. The search team began sweeping every square meter of the lot, initially finding nothing but empty cans, rusted metal, and rotting wooden planks. But roughly in the middle of the area, where the grass was flattened low and the soil had an odd gray tint, an officer bent down and picked up something half buried under the dry earth. A torn document bag, its edges frayed and ripped along the zipper line. The color matched the bag Chloe usually carried to work. When the bag was opened right at the scene, the investigative team saw crumpled papers covered in a fine layer of dust clinging to every surface. Some sheets were still intact, but others had a section torn out as if someone had yanked hard or deliberately removed the information in the corner of the documents. They were all technical notes, calculation drafts, electrical diagrams, handwritten symbols, and some formulas familiar to the NYPA technical team. But interspersed among the papers were a few strange symbols: double helix curves, graphs resembling resonance patterns, and code numbers that no one at NYPA had ever used. They didn't match standard power industry notation, nor did they resemble any internal record-keeping format in the history of Newburgh substation operations. This made the investigative team pause longer than usual. Chloe wasn't the type to jot down random baseless formulas. She was meticulous and adhered to standards. If those symbols appeared in her notes, it meant she had seen or was trying to explain something outside the scope of standard work. Beyond the bag and its contents, the ground around it was unusually distinct. When the investigative team lightly wiped gloved fingers across the surface, the dust clinging to their fingertips had a faint silvery sheen and an uncommon fineness. A technical specialist recognized that this wasn't ordinary soil dust. It was conductive dust, a mixture that typically forms when strong electrical discharges vaporize metal surfaces, causing them to condense into tiny particles. Under normal conditions, this kind of dust only appears at high-voltage stations or near large power equipment. The lot behind the old power plant, which had seen no official activity for more than 6 years, had no reason to be covered in such conductive dust. When the dust sample was collected in a sealed evidence bag, One investigator stood silently looking down at the patch of ground, marked by the heavy drag marks parallel grooves running from the plant's rear door out to the lot where the bag was found. Seeing the clear connection between the physical traces and the recovered evidence, the investigative team realized this area had seen activity on the very afternoon Chloe disappeared. It was even possible she had passed right through this path, or been brought through here during some incident. The document bag was the first piece of evidence directly linked to Chloe since her disappearance, but it clarified far more than the investigative team had expected. First, it confirmed that Chloe had been at the old power plant, at least for a short time before vanishing completely. There was no longer any possibility of explaining it as her taking a wrong turn or just passing by coincidentally. She had lingered long enough at one spot to drop the bag or have it taken from her. Second, the partially torn documents showed intervention by someone who knew exactly what they were erasing or deliberately removing the most critical part. No one knew what the missing section contained, but it clearly related to the calculations Chloe had been working on, the very things she had been closely tracking in the weeks before. When the bag was transferred to the forensics lab, NYPA's technical group was invited to examine the notes. They recognized many familiar symbols related to voltage fluctuations, but the strange double helix notations didn't appear in any technical textbook. A senior engineer said the symbols resembled simulation models for unstable resonance, a type of oscillation no civilian power system ever wants to encounter. Another said it looked like notations once seen in Cole's old documents, but no one would confirm without originals for comparison. The lead investigator noted in the log that the evidence wasn't sufficient to identify a perpetrator or directly indicate what happened to Chloe, but it did something more important. It established that she had approached the exact area where the voltage deviations were occurring and had discovered something strange enough to make her immediately record and describe it using non-standard symbols. Though the torn section left the story incomplete, the nature of the remaining notes showed she had seen or measured something outside the traditional technical catalog system. The discovery of the document bag and the layer of conductive dust caused the investigative team to narrow their analytical focus. They no longer viewed the disappearance as a random assault. All the signs, the ozone smell, the scorch marks, the unauthorized conductors, the metallic noises, the strange lights, and now the conductive dust converged on a single direction, the electrical element. The old power plant wasn't just the place Chloe was last seen. It could be the center of some secret technical activity she had accidentally stumbled upon. While other clues remained contradictory, the chain of technical evidence grew tighter along the same axis, and the investigative team understood that if they wanted to know what had really happened, they had to dig deeper into the electrical factor, the one thing that remained consistent throughout the entire chaotic picture surrounding Chloe Harper's disappearance. Although the torn document bag represented a major breakthrough, those findings still weren't enough to reconstruct the entire event. In the days that followed, the investigative team repeatedly returned to the old power plant, expanding the search area to include the lot behind it, the nearby abandoned railroad strip, and the weedy stretch leading out to the Hudson shore. But everything only led to a terrifying emptiness. No biological traces of Chloe whatsoever. No blood trails, no personal items, no scraps of fabric or strands of hair. Every dig or sweep ended in silence. No body, no DNA, no single piece of physical evidence indicating that Chloe had encountered direct violence. All the police had in hand was the torn bag and the notes with the most critical part ripped away. The absence of a body made any strong hypothesis hard to prove. No one could determine whether Chloe had been attacked, taken elsewhere, or accidentally encountered an incident related to the unauthorized electrical system existing in the old plant. There was no evidence confirming whether she was still alive or dead. In other missing persons cases, abandoned personal details often helped steer the investigation, but this time everything was unnaturally silent, as if her traces had been deliberately erased. Identifying the man in the gray coat only made the situation more complicated. Although the witness described him with high reliability, no one else in the area recognized the description. No camera had captured the man's face. No one saw him enter or leave the plant area. No vehicle was definitively confirmed to be connected. Everything stopped at a fleeting silhouette and a conversation no one overheard clearly. When police entered the gray coat man's description into the regional database, there were no matches. The man in gray became an unfillable void, a blurry puzzle piece in the story with no known place to fit. Raymond Cole's disappearance made the case even murkier. Right when police began considering him a technical suspect, administrative records showed Cole had left Newburgh within 48 hours after Chloe vanished. There was no proof he was fleeing investigation, but departing the city at that exact moment raised many questions. Police verified he no longer lived at his registered address. The rented room was empty, containing only a few old technical papers with no legal value. No one knew where he went. Some said he had once mentioned wanting to leave New York. Others thought he went looking for a place to continue his experiments. But no one knew for sure, and no one knew how he left. Cole's complete vanishing from official view made the investigative team realize they had lost the only person capable of explaining the electrical activity in the old plant. The lack of direct witnesses was a major obstacle. Most people living around the industrial area rarely paid attention to activity there. Those who saw something on the day Chloe disappeared only caught disjointed fragments: the green truck entering, the old sedan leaving, faint flashing light in the night, metallic clanking from a workshop corner. No one saw the full picture, and no statement fully matched another. Police tried building a composite timeline from all statements, but only created more conflicts. If the truck entered first, what did it do? If the sedan left later, who was in it? Was the dragging sound related to a heavy object in the plant, or just wind-rattling metal? No question had a satisfactory answer. Many hypotheses were proposed to re-examine investigative directions. Could Chloe have been robbed? No signs of property theft. Could she have been kidnapped for non-technical purposes? No traces of struggle or scuffle. Could she have fallen into a dangerous area, or gotten trapped in a pipe? No path led to any clear accident. Could she have chosen to leave her current life? Family and colleagues all rejected that, and there were no transactions or signs indicating any intent to leave the city. All the usual hypotheses were ruled out because they didn't match the actual traces at the scene. Each time one was dismissed, the case grew heavier, not from lack of investigative effort, but because the nature of the incident didn't fit any missing persons template police had ever handled. The investigative team also couldn't uncover any network target Chloe might have contacted on the day she disappeared. No messages, no calls, no letters, no recorded appointments. Her route changed without explanation. All that remained was the torn bag and the unfinished notes, the only proof she had actually set foot there. As searches gradually expanded beyond Lake Street, even to the riverbank and railroad-adjacent areas, the investigative team slowly ran out of analytical options. They had no body to confirm homicide, no DNA to trace a perpetrator, no identification of the man in the gray coat, no way to conclude whether Cole was involved or had simply vanished coincidentally at the right time. Every floating piece refused to connect, and the case fell into the state every investigator fears most: unable to move forward anymore. By 1985, after a year with no further leads, Chloe Harper's file was temporarily classified as suspicious missing person. This wasn't a conclusion, just a way to record that Chloe's disappearance was not voluntary and couldn't be definitively ruled a clear crime. A disappearance full of suspicion but without enough data to clarify what was suspicious. The file closed in silence, while the questions remained among the walls of the old power plant, where no one could understand why Chloe chose to go in there and what had been waiting for her inside. By the beginning of 1986, after nearly 2 years of sweeping with no additional physical evidence or new statements, Chloe Harper's disappearance was officially transferred to cold case status. This decision wasn't an abandonment, but a sign that all feasible investigative directions had been exhausted to their maximum without results. When the case was reassigned, manpower allocated to the file dropped sharply. The investigators who had followed Chloe's case from the beginning were forced to shift to new cases, while the cold case unit retained only enough staff for periodic reviews or to handle unexpected leads if someone came forward. Chloe Harper's file gradually slipped into hibernation, a dangerous phase for any investigation. Throughout that year, the city of Newburgh changed little by little. People who once lived around the Lake Street industrial area gradually moved away, leaving behind rusted fences, tightly boarded windows, and land overrun by weeds. The old power plant continued to deteriorate. Its tin roof collapsed in sections, power poles rotted, and rusted staircases broke under the weight of time. In such an aging environment, traces related to the investigation grew fainter by the day. The strange lights in the night, the sound of metal being dragged, the electrical arc marks, all of it survived only in reports. Impossible to recreate. Even the layer of conductive dust that had been sampled became difficult to use because 1980s technology didn't allow deep analysis of its composition or precise identification of its origin. Technical data from that era was far more limited. The voltage fluctuations Chloe had recorded before her disappearance were stored only in crude log form, handwritten or captured on simple tape readers. NYPA's measurement systems at the time had no capability to simulate or reconstruct detailed waveforms. That meant the deviations appearing around the old power plant could not be reanalyzed with high accuracy. Whenever investigators tried to trace the current from that period, they only saw vague oscillating numbers, not sharp enough to infer the source or the structure of the device causing the interference. Also during this time, many key witnesses began leaving Newburgh. The man who saw the green truck moved to Florida to live with his daughter. The woman who saw the old sedan leave the plant, got married, and moved to Pennsylvania. The young man who spotted the strange light was arrested for disorderly conduct and left the city afterward. The remaining witnesses, though they had given statements, could provide no new information because memories had faded or they had seen the events from too far away. Some others passed away from old age or illness, leaving their statements existing only on paper. The gradual disappearance of witnesses over time made an already fragile file even harder to reach the truth. Around the end of 1986, all physical evidence from the case was transferred to Evidence Warehouse Number 4, located in the lower level of the Newburgh Police Building, where unsolved cases not yet eligible for closure were stored. Chloe's torn document bag sat in a sealed box, accompanied by the partially ripped technical notes. The conductive dust samples were kept in 2 small tubes. The map marking the old power plant was folded and simply labeled Lake Street, Location Sweep. These items became silent evidence, placed in a cold corner of the cabinet, reviewed only once a year during inventory checks by the cold case unit. Most notably, Chloe's documents related to the voltage deviations were collected, filed, and coded under the label Undetermined Technical Notes. This meant the content could not be definitively confirmed as directly related to a crime, but the possibility could not be ruled out. Chloe's notes, with their unusual symbols, especially the double helix form that NYPA's technical department did not recognize, were preserved exactly as found but not analyzed further because no suitable analysis tools existed at the time. The technical specialists who reviewed the notes all agreed that some symbols appeared to simulate unstable oscillation patterns, but no one could be certain. Those drafts hovered between 2 possibilities. Either Chloe recorded them to understand a phenomenon she couldn't yet explain, or she had observed the structure of a device outside Newburgh's official technical system. In either case, no tool available in the 1980s could analyze the direction of oscillation, amplitude, or waveform in detail, nor could those symbols be cross-referenced against any technical database because no such database existed. The lack of analytical technology left the case literally motionless. No DNA tracing, no modern forensic equipment, no high-quality cameras. The 1986 investigative team could only rely on statements, physical traces, and logical deduction. But the pieces of Chloe Harper's case refused to connect into a straight line. Every direction led to one of 3 walls. Insufficient physical evidence, insufficient witnesses, or insufficient technology. The sad truth was that even though the investigators didn't want to let go, Chloe Harper's file was placed back into storage. A short note was added to the cover page, "Open pending new evidence." This meant the file wasn't permanently closed, but it would no longer be actively investigated. In reality, almost the entire city gradually forgot the story of the technician who vanished inside the old power plant. People mentioned Chloe with regret in their voices but without hope. Rumors spread through the community and then faded over time. Some believed she had accidentally met with an accident. Others said she was lured by someone. A few thought the power plant held something. Chloe discovered something more dangerous than they imagined. But all of it remained mere speculation. And in evidence warehouse number 4, the box labeled Chloe Harper still sat there, silent as the abandoned power plant itself. Every human effort at that time was limited by technology and circumstance. If the answer still existed in the file, it lay hidden among technical notes no one understood, electrical fluctuations impossible to reconstruct, and an old plant where every trace had dissolved into the dust of time. The case was never entirely forgotten. It was merely pressed down, like a layer of ash covering embers still smoldering beneath. But in 1986, when the file was classified as a cold case, no one knew whether that fire would ever be rekindled. In 1994, nearly a decade after Chloe Harper's case was placed in storage, the New York Power Authority began relocating their old equipment warehouse in Newburgh to a new facility. During the process of sorting and clearing out long-forgotten storage rooms, technical staff discovered a dusty cardboard box without clear labeling, tucked deep in the corner of a metal cabinet. Inside were miscellaneous items, technical drawings, screws, small wire spools, and an old black cassette tape with no identifying label. At first, they thought it was just a recording device used for internal testing sessions. But when a curious technician inserted the tape into a player to test it, the entire room fell into an unusual silence. The sound that emerged was unlike anything they expected. It wasn't conversation, not a meeting recording, nor ordinary static. From the cassette speaker came raw, harsh, electrical arcing like an electric arc striking metal interspersed with faint vibrations that gave the feeling the surrounding space was being compressed. It wasn't the sound of consumer equipment. It resembled the output of an electrical system forced beyond capacity or a homemade device in a state of oscillation. About midway through the recording, a whispered voice cut in. A man's voice, very low, very close to the microphone, as if speaking in a large room without echo. The statement was brief, but it made everyone present look at one another. Not going to let her shut down the resonance. No one fully understood the meaning of that phrase, but the tone, the emphasis, and the strange rhythm immediately brought to mind old reports about resonance in Raymond Cole's rejected documents. It was the term he had used to refer to the oscillation phase his homemade device could produce if activated correctly. That phrase had once been dismissed by NYPA as non-technical, almost personal rather than scientific. Yet now it appeared on an unidentified recording found in the very equipment storage NYPA had used in the 1970s and 1980s. This discovery forced the technical team to contact Newburgh police. When the tape was transferred to the cold case unit, the few remaining investigators from the early days of Chloe Harper's case felt a chill. Most had long since left the investigation, but memories of the strange voltage fluctuations, the ozone smell, and the partially torn technical notes still lingered. The word resonance appeared in no technical files except those connected to Cole. Hearing it from an anonymous tape in 1994 made them unable to avoid asking, had Chloe witnessed something related to the device Cole had once tried to build? To avoid speculation, the tape was sent to the state's audio analysis lab. Specialists began separating frequencies, measuring the vibration of the mixed noise and the whispered voice. Though the recording was heavily degraded, they detected certain segments of the voice carrying characteristics similar to voice samples of Cole that police had archived when he was fired in 1979. Not enough to confirm the two voices belonged to the same person, but enough to raise attention. One technician described it. The way the voice lingers at the end of the sentence, the slight drop in pitch on the last word, it's too similar to ignore. However, even though the audio analysis created a suspicious connection, the tape came with no accompanying physical evidence, no usable fingerprints, no clue identifying who recorded it, no date, no location, no confirmation that the electrical arcing heard on the tape actually came from the old power plant or from any device linked to Cole. The cassette was found in a large NYPA technical warehouse, where hundreds of people had come and gone over the years. No one knew how long it had been there, who placed it, or how many times it had been played. Cold case investigators tried re-examining old evidence from 1984 and 1985 to find a connection, But every effort was blocked by the technological gap. The conductive dust samples collected back then had dried and degraded. Impossible to analyze further. Chloe's notes didn't perfectly match the symbols on the tape. They only shared one concept: unstable resonance. The wall scorch marks, the heavy drag traces, the unauthorized spliced conductors all pointed to dangerous technical activity, but none directly linked to the tape. Once again, police stood before the familiar wall. No physical evidence, no new witnesses, no way to determine when the tape was recorded, and no way to use the tape to reopen the case under legal procedure. Though the tape's content seemed to refer to someone, perhaps Chloe, the speaker on the tape, didn't appear in any official records from the time of the incident. The audio lab's conclusion stated clearly, not sufficient standard to serve as conclusive evidence or investigative link. The investigators had no choice but to do what they didn't want: place the tape in a storage box, assign it a new case number, and add it to the cold case file. On the box label was the line, "Cassette, unverified electrical recording, potential relation to Chloe Harper case." The tape was placed in the same metal cabinet containing Chloe's torn document bag, the unsolved technical notes, and the old power plant map. It became another piece of the puzzle, dark, vague, impossible to place in the picture but also impossible to ignore. In 1997, after many years of the old power plant being left abandoned, the place became a destination for a few groups of adventure-seeking young people, those more curious about ruined structures than afraid of them. One autumn afternoon, 3 young men decided to find a way deeper inside the plant, trying to open the metal doors they had seen before but never stepped through. They circled around the south wall, where trees grew thick, and vines had almost completely covered the original structure, and discovered a thick steel plate pressed flat against the ground, like a manhole cover. What caught their attention was that the steel plate was locked from the outside with a rusted padlock, something far too odd for a facility abandoned so long ago. The old plant doors were usually locked from the inside out, but this padlock was placed where it could be easily accessed, as if someone had locked it recently, or at least checked it not long before. After several hard prees with a metal bar, the padlock snapped open. The steel plate lifted with a grating sound, revealing a narrow descent into a basement via corroded iron steps. All 3 shone their flashlights and stepped down one by one. The space below was smaller than they expected, but it had the structure of an auxiliary room once used for cable or resistor control. Both basement walls were coated in dust, but there were unusual streaks, long, charred burn marks running from the wall edges down to the floor, not much different from the electrical arc traces police had once found in the workshop. One of the 3 bent down, touched lightly, and felt the surface crumble into fine powder with a burnt smell, as if metal had been heat-shocked. When they swept their flashlights toward the left corner of the basement, the light reflected off a small object caught on a curved piece of metal, a fragment of gray-blue wool fabric. The color, texture, and slightly rough surface made it look like the kind of light wool sweater Chloe Harper often wore on work afternoons. They couldn't be certain, but the appearance of the fabric scrap in a place no one visited made all 3 feel they needed to report it to the police. One of them ran outside to find a nearby payphone and called it in. But what happened next plunged the Chloe investigation into shadow once more. When the investigative team arrived at the old power plant about 40 minutes after the call, the basement was completely empty. The steel manhole cover had been lowered and locked again with a different padlock, newer, unlike the rusted one the young men had broken. When they broke the second padlock and shone lights down, the basement contained only smooth concrete walls and a floor covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust. No charred streaks on the walls, no wool fabric fragment, no sign anyone had been down there in years. The entire room, even the steps, looked as though it had just been swept clean or had its interior structure altered. The young men insisted they weren't mistaken. They re-described the location of the fabric scrap, the burn streaks, and how the room had looked before. One even sketched a rough pencil diagram of the basement, including the exact corner wall spot where they found the wool fragment. Yet the scene when police arrived told the opposite story. Everything was pristine and the way a long-abandoned structure should be, unchanged in the slightest. Police checked the dust layer on the floor and noticed something baffling. That thick dust couldn't have accumulated in just 40 minutes. If someone had cleaned the basement after the three young men left, they would have had to recover the entire surface by spreading dust over it. But the dust layer was too even, too natural, showing no signs of sweeping or cleaning movement. These details made the investigators feel inescapably that they were facing a scene someone had controlled in advance. Additional checks inside the plant yielded nothing. No fresh footprints, no equipment or items left behind. No signs the steel manhole cover had been opened recently, except for the force marks the young men had made. The entire scene was as cold as a lake just brushed by wind, only ripples in the accounts, while the water surface remained flat and traceless. When investigators documented the incident, they could not legally prove that the basement had ever contained anything at the moment the three young men discovered it. But the coincidence between the described arc streaks, the fabric resembling what Chloe once wore, and the room being erased in under an hour, forced them to draw a cautious but heavy conclusion. Someone was still monitoring the old power plant and was ready to intervene the instant they detected anyone stepping too deep into the area. The most frightening thing wasn't the disappearance of the evidence, but the speed at which it vanished. This proved the intervener not only understood the plant's structure thoroughly, but also had secret access or was operating regularly there. When the report was added to the cold case file, it was placed alongside documents on unauthorized spliced conductors, scorch marks, conductive dust, and the strange audio cassette. One more piece of the puzzle, different but not contradictory to what was already known. The old power plant had never truly been abandoned, and someone was still working to hide every remaining trace. In the disappearance of Chloe Harper, not much was certain, but from the moment the basement was mysteriously wiped clean, one thing became clear. The area was being controlled from the shadows by someone who didn't want anyone to know what lay beneath the rusted concrete layers of the power plant that had gone dark decades earlier. Entering the early 2000s, forensic analysis technology related to electrical phenomena began to undergo significant changes. State and federal laboratories gradually implemented new techniques capable of separating surfaces affected by electrical discharge and identifying electrical signatures, a form of technical fingerprint in which burn marks leave distinctive imprints of the power source. Each device, depending on conductor material, oscillation amplitude, arc type, and applied voltage, produces its own unique form of damage to materials. What in the 1980s could only be noted through manual observation could now be analyzed using digitized models and compared against databases. During a routine review of long-dormant files to assess the applicability of these new technologies, a forensic specialist noticed a difficult-to-classify case from the 1980s, the disappearance of Chloe Harper. In the evidence list were two samples labeled suspected electrical arc burn marks, unidentified. Because they had been properly sealed, the wall sample taken from the old power plant in 1984 still retained the necessary surface structure for data extraction. This allowed the laboratory to submit the sample for analysis, even though nearly 2 decades had passed. The sealed box revealed a thin, gray-black flaky material peeled from the workshop wall. Under an electron microscope, the burn mark surface displayed grooved drag patterns, as if current had spread horizontally before reaching an overheating state. The analysis team began reconstructing a 3D model of the burn path, comparing metal clumping indices, ionization levels, and mineral vaporization degrees in the brick. They also employed pulse signature analysis, a new technique that captures an electrical discharge profile based on microdistortions in the affected zone. The results surprised many. When the burn mark signature data was cross-referenced with the library of discharge samples from civilian, industrial, and experimental devices, it matched none of the standard equipment. Instead, the sample exhibited signs of repeated high-amplitude oscillating discharge, characteristic of devices using electromagnetic resonance structures, a rare form that appeared only in unofficial research papers or non-standard experiments. When the forensic specialist re-examined documents seized from Raymond Cole in 1979, they found sketches describing his homemade magnetic resonance device that he had once submitted to NYPA. Though the sketches were incomplete and extremely difficult to reconstruct, the description clearly stated that Cole's system could produce short pulse oscillation chains, leading to the potential formation of horizontal spreading burn patterns. That was precisely the characteristic the wall sample displayed. The most critical part emerged when the two models were overlaid. The burn pattern extracted from the old power plant in 1984 matched the theoretical discharge pattern Cole described in his rejected documents. Not a perfect match since Cole's device was never tested in a controlled environment, but the degree of similarity was sufficient to consider this the first direct forensic link to him. No engineer at NYPA during that era had ever created a resonance model of this kind, and no one besides Cole had ever attempted to experiment with a design based on the type of oscillation the wall sample reflected. One cold case investigator noted, "The burn pattern matches unstable resonance structure. The only person capable of operating such a model in the Lake Street area is one individual, Cole." Even so, finding the electrical signature did not equate to solving the case. Though advanced, forensic technology still could not pinpoint the exact timing of the discharge in the plant. The area had been disturbed multiple times over the years, possibly by homeless individuals, vandals, or other activities police were unaware of. There was no DNA on the wall sample, no fingerprints in the basement, no physical evidence directly tying Cole to the plant on the day Chloe disappeared. The basement had been cleaned before police arrived in 1997, eliminating any other potential evidence. The cassette discovered in 1994 contained only sound, no timestamp signal. Chloe's documents still lacked the most important section, the part torn from the draft, and Chloe herself had never been found. Nevertheless, this remained the first forensic turning point. For the first time, a technical piece of evidence pointed directly to a specific individual in the disappearance. Up to that point, Cole had been only a suspect based on eccentric behavior, expertise, and his unusual vanishing. Now, the burn mark sample, though incomplete, showed that the discharge source in the plant aligned with the model Cole had pursued. But in a legal context, it still wasn't enough. The electrical signature comparison was intriguing, yet lacked the reliability needed to charge anyone or officially reopen the file. To do that, police needed what they still did not have: a witness who saw Cole at the plant on the day Chloe disappeared, or physical proof that Cole's device was operated at that time. Without those, the forensic result, important as it was, could only be added to the file, layering one more piece of technical data onto the already tangled picture. The case did not advance in any major way, but it also no longer stood in absolute stasis. Now there was a clear indication that within the old power plant existed a type of electrical discharge only one person was capable of producing. But no one knew where that person was, and everything connected to him remained only fragments of memory covered by the dust of time. In 2024, the cold case unit of Newburgh was restructured to re-examine dormant files involving technical, scientific, and cases deemed too unusual to pursue with traditional methods. In the new investigative team, Detective Marisa Keaton, someone with an electrical power engineering background before joining the force, was assigned to review cases with electronic or energy-related elements. When she saw the case number for Chloe Harper, the old file immediately caught her attention. The disappearance had no body, no DNA, but it was filled with traces related to electricity, oscillations, arcing, and unauthorized devices. A few years earlier, that data would have been hard to exploit, but at the present time, forensic technology had opened up many new possibilities. Keaton spent weeks rereading the entire original file: the old power plant map, the 1984 statements, the torn document bag, the 1994 cassette tape, the report on the cleaned-out basement in 1997, and especially the 2002 forensic report on the electrical arc mark. When she laid all the data out on the analysis board, the once disjointed layers of information gradually found connections. Both the power logs and scientific documents on electrical discharge described abnormal signs appearing precisely in the area Raymond Cole used to frequent. The horizontal spreading discharge structure, characteristic of a magnetic field oscillation device as described by Cole, forced Keaton to ask how many of those seemingly random deviations from 1984 were actually products of his illegitimate device. First, Keaton focused on the power logs Chloe recorded before her disappearance. Modern technology allowed reconstruction of the waveform from the raw tape data of that era. When the forensic engineers ran the simulation, they discovered something noteworthy. The oscillation sequence on June 14, 1984, was not just scattered noise. Instead, the waveform had a cyclic structure, with peaks repeating at regular intervals of about 3.4 seconds. This kind of oscillation is rare in nature but very close to the resonance oscillation model Cole once recorded in his band drawings. It was this steady repeating rhythm feature that convinced Keaton the person generating the oscillation had deliberately tuned the device to maintain a prolonged resonance state. To understand more clearly, Keaton borrowed back the basic sketches from Cole, the documents once rejected by NYPA for being dangerous. Many parts of the drawings were wrong or extremely unsafe, but certain pathways, coil diagrams, and oscillation models matched directly with the characteristics recorded by forensics in 2002. Keaton began reconstructing a model of this device. She used modern simulation software, testing combinations of power parameters, self-triggered oscillations, and voltage deviations that Chloe had once monitored. Just a few hours into the simulation, the model displayed results clear enough. Cole's device, though incomplete, had the capability to produce exactly the same type of oscillation as the waveform that appeared on the afternoon Chloe disappeared. This was not at the level of possible coincidence, but a characteristic match. No civilian power source in 1984 could generate such a resonance rhythm, let alone produce the kind of heat and burn marks that matched the forensic sample taken from the workshop wall. When Keaton overlaid the three data sets, the 1984 oscillation, the 1984 burn mark, and the band 1979 drawing the abnormal variation curves began to align in a way that could only be understood in one direction. Within the old power plant existed a device operating on the principle of unstable resonance, and that was something Chloe may have discovered. Another piece of data further reinforced this. The timing of the strongest oscillation peak on June 14, 1984, almost perfectly coincided with the moment the witness saw Chloe standing next to the man in the gray coat. If that was Cole, it meant his device was either in operation or about to be activated at that time. One of the old arguments in the file had claimed the oscillation that day wasn't large enough to pose danger, but with modern forensic technology, Keaton realized the opposite. That oscillation peak contained an unusual form of energy compression, as if the device had remained in resonance long enough to accumulate a large amount of heat in the core conductor. That state could produce sudden, arcing, powerful discharge, or incidents that anyone standing nearby would never anticipate. That placed Chloe in a dangerous position at the exact moment the oscillation surged. If she was checking the source of the deviation, the likelihood that she approached Cole's device was very high, and if that device lost stability, she could have been directly affected by the discharge incident or prevented by Cole from shutting it down, both scenarios plausible based on the technical data. Keaton understood that these technical puzzle pieces could only advance the file further if verified by modern forensics, so she submitted a formal request to the state laboratory. Reanalyze all physical evidence, including the conductive dust layer, the charred wall fragment, the wool fabric scrap collected in 1997, whether recovered or not, along with the audio tapes, according to the latest forensic standards. Current technology allows analysis of ion structures in electrical dust, examination of micrometal traces, frequency decay audio comparison, and even reconstruction of electromagnetic waveforms based on arc distortion. For Keaton, this was not aimless file expansion but the only logical reconstruction step. No other suspect in the disappearance had technical knowledge as deep as Cole. No one else had motive to create an unauthorized resonance device. And no statement fit the electrical discharge signs as well as Cole's presence around the plant. When the reanalysis request was approved, Chloe Harper's file dormant for nearly 40 years was once again placed under the white light of the forensic lab. But this time, it was no longer viewed simply as a disappearance. From all the data Keaton had gathered, it was clear this was an event tightly bound to a technical element, where the technology of that era was completely inadequate to recognize the nature of what happened inside the old power plant. And now, with modern tools, Keaton believed they could finally revisit those old pieces of evidence with fresh eyes, something the case had never had in its entire 4-decade existence. In 2025, while the state laboratory proceeded with reanalyzing all the evidence at Detective Marisa Keaton's request. A new forensic technology had just been widely deployed: microtrace DNA extraction. This technique separates trace amounts of DNA trapped in non-biological material, conductive dust, ionized metal particles, arc residue, things that 2 decades earlier were considered impossible to analyze biologically. Microtrace works by amplifying heat and light-deformed molecules, reconstructing fragmented DNA strands into sequences long enough to match against databases. In the Chloe Harper file, the single most important piece of evidence for testing this technique was the layer of conductive dust coating the pages of the documents found inside the torn bag. In 1984, the investigative team collected that dust only for metal composition analysis. The technology of the time could not determine whether DNA was present. But now, it became the most promising data source, because this was dust that had directly adhered to papers Chloe was holding at the moment she appeared in the power plant area. The laboratory began the microtrace process. The electrical dust was layered apart, dissolved with neutral enzyme solution, then passed through ion separation to remove heavy metal content. When the scanner started signaling, the forensic specialists did not expect anything clear. Most DNA exposed to electrical discharge is usually destroyed beyond recovery. But this time, they found trace human DNA embedded inside the larger dust particles that had crystallized when the arc's heat melted metal on the wall. A small proportion of the DNA was protected by the metal ion layer, as if it had been encapsulated during the discharge process. This is so rare that many labs see only a handful of cases in thousands of samples. After 27 hours of amplification, the analysis unit obtained enough DNA sequences to submit to CODIS. When the data ran the comparison, the screen displayed a single match: Raymond Cole. Match probability is greater than 99.87%. No second DNA sample. No background noise. No match to any other record. The only person whose DNA appeared in the conductive dust adhering to Chloe's documents was Raymond Cole, who had left Newburgh just 2 days after she disappeared. The lab called Keaton immediately. She stood motionless in front of the screen for a long moment, as if trying to process a fact that no one had grasped in 40 years. Every suspicion, every speculation, every vague thread of connection was now nailed down by irrefutable forensic evidence. Cole had been in the same space as Chloe when that dust settled on the paper. And that dust could not have appeared unless she had approached the discharge area, meaning the very device or power source Cole had set up inside the plant. But that was not the full breakthrough. Alongside the DNA analysis, microtrace also allowed examination of the metal compounds still trapped in the dust particles. A long list appeared with concentrations of tungsten, nickel, ferrite, and especially one rare compound: magnetically processed cobalt manganese alloy, which typically appears only in homemade resonance cores that Cole had mentioned in his 1979 design. This compound was not used in any commercial equipment in Newburgh at that time. It could only exist if Cole had personally fabricated or assembled part of a device according to the exact model he had once tried to present. When Keaton cross-referenced the data, the conclusion could not have been clearer. Chloe had touched or stood near Cole's discharge device. Cole was present when the device was activated. The dust layer was a direct product of illicit electrical activity, and his DNA adhered to that dust at precisely that moment. All of this confirmed that Chloe's presence at the plant was not random, and Cole's presence could not be dismissed as coincidence. She encountered him, or came into contact with his device, during the period of the largest voltage oscillation that day. What particularly caught Keaton's attention was the compatibility between the microtrace dust sample and the wall burn pattern analyzed in 2002. The cobalt manganese alloy was also found in trace amounts in the old wall fragment. This proved that Cole's device was not merely theoretical, it had been operated at least once, and that operation left its imprint on the wall, on the dust, and on Chloe's papers. A veteran cold case investigator wrote in the log, "This is the first time in the file that direct physical evidence links Cole to the scene. No longer technical suspicion or behavioral inference. This is DNA and material structure in absolute match." Chloe stood near Cole's device, and Cole stood near Chloe. After the results were confirmed a second time by an independent lab, Keaton immediately presented the report to the Orange County District Attorney. With the DNA and matching material traces, they had sufficient legal basis to request an emergency search warrant for the entire old power plant area, any locations Cole had once resided in, and anywhere he might have stored technical equipment. The warrant was signed in under 3 hours. That very afternoon, technical task forces coordinated with NYPA and the forensic unit entered the plant area. This was no ordinary search. They approached with magnetic measurement devices, handheld thermal scanners, and arc sensors to detect any residual traces of a resonance device. Another team was assigned to review archived records of facilities Cole had rented or borrowed in 1984. Every technical item, component, notebook, metal fragment, everything became potential evidence. Keaton also requested re-examination of all wall samples, dust samples, and even the 1994 cassette tape once more, using the latest frequency separation technology. If Cole's DNA appeared in the dust on the documents, the likelihood of his DNA existing in other evidence was very high. This was the breaking point the case had never had in 40 years. Chloe Harper had not merely passed through the power plant by chance. She had come into direct contact with the device Cole had built. And Cole, through his own DNA, had stood at the place where conductive dust settled on her papers. From that moment, Chloe Harper's case shifted from an unsolvable cold case to a file with a clear suspect, physical traces, a criminal model, and a specific investigative path. For the first time in decades, every piece fit together. Electrical oscillations, burn marks, the cassette tape, the cleaned-out basement, the conductive dust layer, and now Cole's DNA, all pointing to a single point. And with the new search warrant, police were not only tracing back Cole's technical traces, but also preparing to confront the biggest question of the case. What had Cole done inside the old power plant on the day Chloe disappeared, and why? The search of Raymond Cole's house began as soon as the task force arrived at the last address he had rented before leaving Newburgh. The small suburban home had been left to rot by time, with warped wooden doors and dust thick on the porch. But the garage in the back was where the investigative team focused their attention. When the metal door was raised, the lights revealed a space no one expected to remain intact after 4 decades. Large copper coils scorched at the contact points, a deformed steel core, and deep purple-black electrical arc streaks etched into the wooden workbench surface. In the middle of the garage lay a large drawing spread out on plywood. The title written clearly in the familiar handwriting from Cole's old documents, Torus Resonance 7. The drawing described the structure of a device based on a toroidal induction coil, with asymmetrically wound coil layers. What stood out most was the note beside the pathway. Repeating oscillation 3.4 seconds, exactly matching the simulation results Keaton had obtained. Next to the drawing was a small wooden board, written in chalk, 1984 test schedule. In the list, each entry was marked with dates from March to June. When Keaton ran her finger across the board, she stopped at the double underlined prominent line, 14/6 resonance threshold reached. The resonance threshold was what Chloe had recorded in the power logs, and it was also the starting sign for the strongest oscillation in the file. There was no longer any doubt that Cole had operated the device during the period when Chloe disappeared. As the forensics team continued sweeping the garage, they found an old wooden box containing many shattered insulating porcelain fragments. The off-white, yellowish color, and thick glaze made Keaton immediately recognize these were not household items. After measuring sizes and cross-referencing, the specialists confirmed they were insulating pieces of the type used at NYPA substations, the kind reported missing in 1983 and 1984, but never traced to a culprit. Cole possessing them showed he had taken materials directly from the city's power system to serve his resonance design. This not only proved he had the capability to assemble the device, but also provided evidence that the oscillations Chloe monitored at the time of her disappearance could very well have been produced by the materials right there in that wooden box. In a dark corner of the garage, where the floor soil had been scorched into spotted burns by electrical discharge, Keaton discovered a thick, hardcover notebook, open to the middle page, as if someone had stopped writing abruptly. The notebook recorded Cole's entire experimental process, from 1979 to 1984, with dozens of pages carefully detailing voltage measurements, technical errors, overheating levels, and oscillation variance. But the page that made the entire investigative team stop was the entry for June 14th, 1984. The handwriting was shaky, ink smudged in streaks, but the words were still legible. Resonance reached unstable threshold. Core heating beyond prediction. She got closer than safe distance. Margin of error will destroy everything. Throughout the entire notebook, Cole never used she or Chloe to refer to anyone else. The only person he could possibly have been referring to was Chloe Harper. Keaton read that line over and over in tense silence. This was not speculation, not intuition. These were Cole's own words, written on the very day Chloe disappeared, acknowledging the presence of a woman at the location of an operating device. And not just presence. The phrase margin of error will destroy everything reflected his own fear. If Chloe got too close to the resonance core, a device in that state could lose stability, produce sudden discharge, or explode its coils. Chloe understood technical matters and could have recognized its danger, something Cole could not allow. The notebook also had a small note in the margin. Unplanned contact, a phrase both vague and alarming. It showed Chloe had not come there by Cole's arrangement. She came because she detected the power deviation. Cole had not expected her to appear. The intersection of Cole's actions and Chloe's duties was no longer scientific conjecture. It was direct evidence that they had met while the device was running. And if the device entered an unstable state, the consequences would affect not only the equipment but also whoever stood beside it. As the forensics team checked further boxes in the garage, they found scorched copper wire, slightly melted steel cores, and especially handwritten diagrams illustrating how Cole had amplified current from the city grid to feed his torus resonance device. One sheet clearly marked the pathway leading back to the old power plant, where Cole could draw direct current through abandoned feeder lines. This matched perfectly with the voltage data Chloe had recorded. The deviations did not originate from the civilian grid but from an intermediary point, the very place Cole had positioned his device. Near the back of the garage, behind a metal box containing broken equipment, the forensics team discovered a dust-covered canvas bag filled with spare components, circuit breakers, homemade splices, old capacitors. Among them was a small gray fabric scrap with light burn marks along the edge. Although it could not be immediately confirmed, Keaton knew the color and texture matched the type of sweater Chloe commonly wore, just like the fragment they had once seen in the wiped-clean basement in 1997. All the evidence recovered from the garage: scorched coils, test schedule, insulating porcelain fragments, torus resonance 7 diagrams. The June 14th, 1984 notebook entry formed an undeniable picture. Cole had encountered Chloe on the day she disappeared, and his device was at the center of everything that happened inside the old power plant. There were no longer gaps for speculation, no longer ownerless questions. Cole's house contained every answer the case had waited 40 years for, and now the only remaining question was not, was Cole involved? But what happened between Cole, Chloe, and the resonance device in that final moment? The interrogation of Raymond Cole did not begin in an atmosphere of confrontation right from the start. He walked into the room quietly, with tired eyes but no panic, as if after 40 years, being brought back to the center of a case did not surprise him. He sat down in the chair, placed his two hands clasped together on the metal table, and waited silently for the investigator to speak. Detective Marissa Keaton did not rush. She placed in front of him a copy of the June 14th, 1984 notebook entry, the torus resonance 7 diagram, and the microtrace DNA results. When she asked the first question, "What were you doing in the old power plant on the day Chloe Harper disappeared?" Cole blinked slowly and then answered in a near whisper, "I was just trying to keep the resonance stable. She shouldn't have stopped it." There was no tremor in that statement, but something cold spread through the room. The admission that Chloe had been at the scene came out so calmly it was unnatural. Keaton leaned forward. "What did she do that made you concerned?" Cole gave a slight curl of his lip, half defensive, half regretful. She didn't understand what stage the device was in. When the resonance starts forming, everything is very fragile. If you shut it down at the wrong rhythm, the feedback will destroy the core. I had warned her. That sentence matched the note in the notebook. She got too close to the core. Margin of error will destroy everything. Keaton slid the photo of the 1984 burn mark across the table. You call this feedback? Cole stared at the photo for a long time. No evasion, no looking away. That's part of it. The core overheated. I didn't think it would arc that strongly. The vagueness in his words could not hide their weight. This was an indirect admission that the device he had built had caused the discharge incident, the one forensics had taken years to prove. Keaton placed the torn document bag on the table next. Inside were Chloe's notes, on which conductive dust carrying Cole's own DNA had adhered. Do you have any explanation for your DNA being on the documents Chloe was carrying? For the first time in the interrogation, Cole's eyebrows furrowed, but not from confusion, rather from acceptance. I tried to pull her out of the resonance zone. When the current reached threshold, no one should stand close. Keaton seized on the statement. You touched her. Cole did not deny it, only nodded. If she touched the core while it was unstable, the feedback would double. I needed to keep her away. Keaton turned the Taurus Resonance 7 drawing toward him. Where did you pull her? Cole kept his eyes fixed on the drawing, his gaze sinking into the spirals he himself had created 4 decades earlier. Down to the basement, he answered after a few seconds. Only there did I have enough time to bring the core back to a safe level. She couldn't keep interfering. Keaton did not miss the key word. You took her down to the basement, or dragged her? Cole fell silent. Time in the interrogation room passed in thick tension. Finally, he said, she didn't want to leave the device. She thought I was causing interference in the system, but she didn't understand that if you cut it at the wrong moment, everything would collapse. The way he described the events made it sound like a technical argument, but in reality it was evidence admitting coercive behavior. Keaton slowly pushed forward a photo simulation of the garage. Scorched coils, stolen insulating porcelain fragments. The test schedule marked with the day Chloe disappeared. What did you do after you pulled her down to the basement? Cole looked down at the table, his hands clenching. I tried to stabilize the resonance, but he paused, his throat twitching slightly. She touched the secondary conductor. I wasn't quick enough to stop her. From a forensic perspective, this was the description of an arc incident. Heat generated from feedback beyond threshold could cause severe burns or instant unconsciousness. Keaton pressed on. The discharge happened as you described. Chloe was injured. Cole closed his eyes. A small movement that said more than any defense. I heard the sound. Very brief. Not what I predicted. When the light went out, he stopped. No further explanation. But that gap was enough for the investigative team to understand what had happened in the basement that year. Keaton continued. Where did you take her after that? Cole shook his head. I don't remember everything. I just wanted to shut down the device before it caused more feedback. The investigator did not let him escape with a vague answer. You remembered enough to write in the notebook. Unplanned contact. You remembered clearly pulling her into the basement. You remembered her touching the core. You remembered the device discharging. But you don't remember what happened to her? This time Cole stayed silent too long, forcing the investigators to strain to catch every small change in his breathing. Finally, he spoke in a hoarse, low voice. Resonance. When it breaks, it doesn't always leave things intact. No one in the room needed further explanation. Cole had just admitted that Chloe had died due to the very device he was operating, an unintended but catastrophic technical accident that occurred when she tried to intervene and stop the system. Her death was not intentional murder, but the direct consequence of unauthorized, dangerous, and completely uncontrolled experimental activity. When the interrogation ended, Cole showed no reaction as he signed the statement transcript. The final line of the interrogation report was brief. Suspect admits presence at the scene, admits coercive contact, describes incident leading to unintended death. But for the Chloe Harper case, the case that had lain in darkness for 4 decades, that statement formed the final piece to establish the truth. Chloe died in the basement, right next to the device Cole had built, On the very day the voltage deviations vanished from the Newburgh system, right after concluding the interrogation and freezing all evidence recovered from the garage, the Orange County District Attorney signed an arrest warrant for Raymond Cole on 2 charges that had never before appeared together in the same case. Kidnapping in the first degree because Cole admitted to forcibly dragging Chloe into the basement against her will, and reckless homicide via engineering experiment, an extremely rare charge applied only in deaths caused by unauthorized experimental technical devices posing a sufficient level of danger to constitute reckless disregard for human safety. Once the warrant was issued, Newburgh police coordinated with Pennsylvania authorities, where Cole had resided in recent years, to execute the extradition. The task force found him in an old apartment in Scranton, living alone in social isolation, but he offered no resistance when the arrest warrant was read. He asked only one question: "The device, is it still there?" No one answered, and Cole said nothing more. On the drive back to New York, he sat in silence, hands cuffed in front, eyes staring out the window as if chasing a thought from 4 decades earlier, a thought only he knew. When Cole was brought to Newburgh Police Headquarters, the case was immediately made public. The press conference held by the district attorney drew massive media attention due to the unusual nature of the incident. It was not a murder driven by hatred, not a dispute over money or personal conflict, not a classic violent motive. This was a case whose motive revolved around a homemade electromagnetic resonance device operated illegally inside an abandoned power plant, causing the death of a power monitoring engineer who was trying to prevent a risk of system instability. The press called it the darkest technical case in history. While the Newburgh community was stunned, a man long considered eccentric but harmless had held the key to the city's most mysterious death. In initial interviews with the public defender, Cole continued to assert a single argument: he had no intention of harming Chloe. He repeated that the device was in a fragile resonance state, that Chloe's presence was unplanned, that he only wanted to stabilize the oscillation again. But the prosecution did not focus on intent. They focused on actions. He dragged her into the basement, prevented her from leaving a dangerous position that constituted unlawful confinement, leading to death. There was no consent, no voluntariness. The law regarded that as kidnapping. Moreover, forensics had completed an irrefutable chain of evidence. Cole's DNA was present in the conductive dust, adhering to Chloe's documents proving direct contact. The metal structure in the dust matched the cobalt-manganese alloy characteristic of Cole's resonance design, proving his device was operating right beside Chloe. The burn marks in the plant matched the discharge pattern produced by Cole's model, proving the discharge source originated from his device. The notebook clearly documented the events of June 14th, 1984, and admitted Chloe got too close to the core, proving Cole knew she was there and understood the level of danger. All of it combined into a forensic file strong enough to construct a complete indictment. Cole operated an unauthorized device, creating a hazardous environment. He forced Chloe into a controlled area. He recognized the risk of death, but did not stop the operation, and that conduct directly caused her death. When police finalized the final charging document, there were no gaps left to fill with hypotheses. They relied on scientific data, Cole's admissions, physical evidence found in the garage, and modern forensic models, all linked tightly along a seamless timeline. The district attorney wrote in the report, "This is the first time in Orange County history that a kidnapping charge has been prosecuted alongside reckless homicide based on electrical power technology." While awaiting trial, Cole maintained an even tone. No resistance, no panic, no attempts to justify himself. His attorney tried to focus on the unintended accident element, but every time they mentioned the device was not designed to cause harm, the prosecution countered with the Torus Resonance 7 drawing and Cole's own note clearly stating, "Feedback can destroy the core." For the court, that was sufficient to prove Cole fully understood the danger yet still operated the device, still brought or dragged Chloe into the discharge zone. The reckless homicide charge formed from that very awareness. The case shocked not only because of its technical nature but also because of its duration. 40 years, countless false leads, dozens of conflicting witnesses. Many misguided theories, but in the end, it was electrical forensics and DNA that brought the case to its conclusion. At the wrap-up briefing after the arrest, Keaton said only one sentence. Technology finally caught up to the truth. Cole neither refuted nor added anything. When asked if he wanted to send any message to Chloe's family, he only replied, "I don't think she would try to stop the resonance. I think she understood it." That was the only statement carrying a hint of regret, but that regret could not change what had happened in the power plant basement in 1984. Nor could it alter the indictment that police and prosecutors had closed with a chain of evidence so powerful it could not be refuted. The trial of Raymond Cole opened on a morning in October 2025, in an atmosphere of solemnity but heavy weight. The case had drawn attention not only in Newburgh but also in the national electrical science community, because this was one of the rare instances where a homemade resonance device became the center of a kidnapping and reckless homicide case. When Cole was led into the courtroom, he did not look at the gallery, but only bowed his head slightly toward the jury, people who were about to confront a volume of technical information that no case had ever required them to absorb. The prosecutor began by reconstructing the picture of that day. Chloe Harper, the power monitoring engineer, tracking unusual deviations. Cole, the man fired by NYPA for dangerous research, and the old power plant, where the resonance device had been illegally assembled. But instead of describing it verbally, the prosecutor used an interactive 3D model, the first time such a tool had been used in an Orange County courtroom, so the jury could see with their own eyes the structure of torus resonance 7, along with its abnormal discharge risk. When the model appeared, the coil layers were recreated, the toroidal path rotated slowly, and the display showed the 3.4-second oscillation level exactly as Cole's notebook recorded and as forensics had confirmed. The prosecutor explained step by step. When the device reached an unstable resonance state, even a small misalignment in the connection could trigger an electric arc dozens of times stronger than household current. The jury watched the simulation of the arc shooting from the coils not like a spark, but like a thick, sharp, powerful beam of light. The prosecutor paused the image at that moment and said, "This is the environment Chloe Harper was dragged into against her will. This was not a laboratory. This was an abandoned facility with no circuit breakers, no protective shielding. And the defendant activated the device knowing full well the risks were like this." The prosecution then called the first expert witness to the stand, an electrical forensics specialist from the state laboratory. He presented the discharge signature analysis conducted in 2002 and expanded in 2024-2025. He explained why the burn marks on the old power plant wall, the burn marks in Cole's garage, and other discharge samples matched almost perfectly. This is not random damage. This is an electrical signature discharge signature that only occurs when a device using cobalt manganese alloy operates in a toroidal structure. And this type of device existed in only one place, the model Raymond Cole built. He also presented the microtrace DNA analysis. On the layer of conductive dust, adhering to the victim's notes, we found the defendant's own DNA. That means the defendant had direct contact with the documents Chloe was carrying at the moment the electrical discharge dust was released. The jury reacted more visibly to this point. Though burn marks or resonance models were hard for them to grasp, DNA was something unmistakable. The prosecutor asked the expert one final question. In your opinion, was there any other discharge source in the Newburgh area in 1984 that could have produced this burn pattern? Expert: no. No civilian equipment, no accident, no industrial machine at that time could have generated an arc pattern like the defendant's resonance system. That assertion reinforced the core axis of the prosecution's argument. The death was not due to natural disaster, not due to personal assault, but due to a dangerous device the defendant assembled and operated without any safety standards. The prosecution's next presentation focused on motive, but not the classic criminal motive. They did not allege hatred, jealousy, or financial conflict. Instead, they called to the stand a technical psychology expert with experience analyzing behavior in individuals obsessed with deviant scientific models. This expert said, the defendant did not intend to kill, but he was obsessed with proving his device worked. to the point of underestimating the risk of causing death. To him, in that moment, Chloe was not a person, she was a variable that could collapse the device. His distorted belief in protecting the resonance state led him to coercive and uncontrolled behavior. The prosecutor emphasized this conclusion with the statement, "It must be understood that the motive here did not come from the darkness of human nature, but from the darkness of a misguided belief in science." In the courtroom, many people nodded. They began to understand why this case went far beyond the template of ordinary murders. The defense Cole's attorney attempted to counter with 2 points. First, they argued the incident was an unforeseeable accident. Second, they claimed Cole had no intent to harm because he tried to pull Chloe out of the danger zone. But the prosecution countered with Cole's own notebook, his own handwriting. "She got too close to the core. Margin of error will destroy everything." The prosecutor stood before the jury and said, "If the defendant fully understood that margin of error could destroy everything, yet continued to operate the device, then it was no longer an accident. It was conduct showing reckless disregard for another person's life." When the prosecution presented the final piece of evidence, the 3D simulation of the discharge incident, the courtroom fell silent. The model recreated the arc, shooting out at an angle matching the real burn marks in the old power plant. Then the simulation paused at the final moment, indicating the zone where Chloe could have been standing based on the recovered DNA dust. The prosecutor stated, "There is no longer any doubt. The victim stood in the feedback zone. The defendant brought her there, and his device killed her." The defense could not refute the model. Every argument they raised was dismantled layer by forensics. Margin of error, oscillation, physical evidence, DNA, notebook. When closing arguments ended, Cole sat motionless, hands flat on the table, palms down on the cold wood. He did not resist, nor did he cry. He simply stared straight ahead, as if looking at an invisible fixed point. Finally, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury took only 3 hours to reach a verdict. No hesitation, no division, no sighs in the room, only the clean efficiency of the law as it found its path through 40 years of obscurity. Guilty on all counts. The trial concluded not with drama, but with a heaviness that sank deeply into everyone present. The truth, though brought to light, brought no gentle ending. Cole was led away, looking at no one, saying nothing. And the Chloe Harper file, one of Newburgh's most difficult cold cases, finally had the answer the world had waited nearly half a century for. When the jury announced the guilty verdict on all counts, the sentence for Raymond Cole was pronounced swiftly and decisively. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized that this was not just an ordinary reckless homicide case, but an act that placed deviant science above human safety, resulting in death and stretching across 41 years before the truth was finally exposed. Cole showed no reaction as the sentence was read. He stood motionless, hands hanging at his sides, eyes not directed toward Chloe's family, not toward the jury, but into the empty space in front of him where, perhaps, he had once seen resonance as something beyond human. When he was led out of the courtroom, the door closed behind him with a sharp sound that echoed in the room that had witnessed Newburgh's longest and strangest investigative journey. After the trial, the case's impact spread beyond the criminal realm. NYPA, the New York Power Authority, the agency that had once directly managed the grid, Chloe monitored, conducted a full review of its procedures for handling power deviations. The Chloe Harper case revealed a critical gap. The abnormal signatures Chloe detected had been dismissed as minor deviations, not significant enough to trigger alerts, forcing her to go to the scene alone, without support. Starting from the end of 2025 onward, NYPA mandated the implementation of an engineer-level alert protocol in which any unexplained repeating oscillation sequence, even at low levels, must be rapidly analyzed using AI waveform systems. No engineer would ever again be permitted to handle deviations in abandoned facility zones alone. Every task would automatically be assigned a support team. This regulation was unofficially nicknamed within the organization the Harper Protocol. In the forensic community, the Chloe Harper case became a major milestone. Universities teaching forensic engineering began using the case as standard material in forensic engineering cases courses. Students learned how to analyze burn marks, arc signatures, conductive dust structures, and especially the microtrace DNA technology, the technique that pulled the case out of a 4-decade dead end. Textbooks described how 3 lines of data, electrical, physical, and biological, merged to form a complete indictment. A living testament that modern forensics can recover truth, even when no body remains, and most evidence has faded with time. In Newburgh, the community's reaction carried 2 tones, heavy and relieved. Many who lived through the 1984 era still remembered the unease when a young, brilliant, and dedicated engineer like Chloe vanished without a trace. In the years that followed, the old power plant became a symbol of an unnamed obsession. Now, with the truth finally revealed, that feeling did not disappear entirely, but it found form. No longer a ghost story, no longer rumor, no longer an inexplicable mystery. It was a fatal accident caused by an unauthorized experimental device, and a man who placed misguided faith in dangerous experimentation. The city held a small memorial by the Hudson shore, where Chloe often walked in the afternoons, her family now much older but still holding sharp memories of the woman who always noted everything in her notebook, stood watching candles reflect on the water. One family member said, "What hurts us most is not that Chloe died, but that she died while doing what she believed was right, protecting a system thousands of people rely on every day." For the Newburgh police, closing the Chloe Harper file marked the end of one of the city's longest and most difficult cold cases. The file had repeatedly been considered unsolvable, once classified as suspicious missing person, endured years with no progress, been shelved for lack of forensics, lack of evidence, lack of technology. After 41 years, it was closed, not by luck, but by the persistence of investigators, by modern tools, by electrical forensics, DNA, oscillation models, and the few lines Cole himself had once handwritten in his notebook, lines he never imagined would become the centerpiece of an indictment. In the cold case storage room of the Newburgh Police Department, the box labeled Chloe Harper 1984 received a new label: Case closed, 2025, conviction secured. The evidence custodian placed the box back on the shelf beside long-closed cases. No applause, no cheers, only the faint metallic sound as the box touched the rack, a simple sound, but one carrying the full weight of 41 years spent searching for answers. And so, the case that once bewildered an entire city, once challenged the forensic world, once lay shrouded in the vagueness of outdated technology, was finally set down. Newburgh closed a dark chapter in its history and knew that no mystery, no matter how long it lasts, can stand forever against science and human persistence. The story of Chloe Harper, a dedicated engineer who vanished in the heart of Newburgh in 1984, and whose truth was only uncovered after 41 years, delivers a profound lesson for modern American life, where science, technology, and professional responsibility are more intertwined than ever. Chloe disappeared because she faced an electrical deviation alone, one the system of that time deemed minor, forcing her to go to the old power plant without support or safety protocols. This detail reflects a reality many Americans still encounter today. In many professions, from engineering to healthcare to cybersecurity, individuals sometimes face risks in isolation because systems have not caught up to the situation. Cole's operation of an unauthorized resonance device, something he believed was technical progress, offers an important lesson. Unverified knowledge, deviant scientific belief, and unauthorized experimentation outside safety frameworks can cause consequences far greater than anticipated. From the burn marks, the conductive dust on Chloe's documents, to the concealed basement testing, the story reminds us that in a society where technological innovation moves rapidly, ethical responsibility must always accompany creativity. Finally, the long journey of the case, from years of forgotten cold case status to the arrival of modern forensics and microtrace DNA, sends a powerful message to Americans. Scientific progress can repair what time once left us powerless against, but it only truly matters when placed in the hands of dedicated people like Detective Marisa Keaton, those who refuse to let truth remain in the shadows. In today's life, that becomes a reminder. Speak up, ask questions, Demand transparency, because truth will not rise on its own if no one persistently seeks it. If you want to continue joining us on decades-long investigative journeys like the Chloe Harper case, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we keep searching for the truth behind America's biggest mysteries.